Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we focus on a new book by University of North Carolina Chapel Hill historian Klaus Larres entitled Uncertain Allies, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Threat of a United Europe, published by Yale University Press in late November. Joining us this afternoon as a discussant is Carolyn Eisenberg of Hofstra University. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University, co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my colleague Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson Center. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. And for over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly in pre-COVID times, in person at the Wilson Center, and since the pandemic, well, here in the virtual realm. And for those of you who like to plan ahead, we have another 15 or so sessions on our calendar running through the end of May. Behind the scenes are two people who make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. And I'd like to thank an institutional supporter, the George Washington University Department of History, as well as a number of anonymous donors. And as I say every single week, we invite you to join their ranks. On the logistics front, please note today's session is being recorded and will soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. Those watching on Facebook Live can email questions to Rachel Wheatley at rwheatley@historians.org. We will call on as many folks as we can. And with that, I turn over the program to my colleague, Christian Osterman. Christian, it's yours.
Thanks, Eric. Delighted to introduce and moderate today's panel with Professor Klaus Larres and Carolyn Eisenberg, two distinguished scholars that I'm very much looking forward to engaging with and having them engage with each other. Let me introduce Klaus first, and we'll hear his talk, and then I'll introduce Carolyn for her commentary and thoughts on the book and the presentation. Professor Klaus Larres is the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor in History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Previously, he held the Henry A. Kissinger Chair at the Library of Congress, was a senior policy advisor to the German embassy in Beijing, China, taught at Yale, Johns Hopkins, SAIS, and the University of London and Queen's University Belfast, and he was a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Among his many publications, and I should say there's a long list of them, let me just single out Churchill's Cold War, The Politics of Personal Diplomacy. Klaus, welcome to the Washington History Seminar. Fire away.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure. I would like to thank the National History Seminar and the Woodrow Wilson Center for inviting me today, particularly to Christian, who had the great idea of asking me to talk about this book, which has just come out, and I can't help it but really show it to you because I thought it has been very nicely produced. And I came to write this book and to think about the issues involved, transatlantic relations, that is again, yes, because I noticed that over time, the American commitment to creating a united Europe has waned. And I saw the early 1970s as a tipping point, as a turning point about that. There was, of course, skepticism before, but never as great as it developed in the early 1970s. After Nixon, they stopped supporting and the creation of a united Europe on the model of the United States of America. At best, the Americans decided to let the Europeans get on with it without interfering. At worst, they did interfere and wanted to actively prevent the creation of a united Europe. During the Nixon era itself, you find both a certain passive attitude, let the Europeans get on with it, they or active attempts to undermine the creation of a united Europe. And that particularly was the case in the years 1972, 1973. And here Henry Kissinger was a proponent of that idea of doing so. The high point of American antagonism towards that, of course, happened only very recently. That happened during the Trump era. Here, we may all remember that President Trump called the EU a foe in trade relations. He encouraged Brexit and encouraged other countries in the EU to follow the British example out of the European Union, meaning that would have destroyed the very existence of the European Union. He asked French President Macron to enter into a bilateral trade with the United States. He would get a much better deal than the EU was getting from the United States. And also Trump's very difficult relations with Angela Merkel known, and of course Trump wanted to leave NATO. All this indicated that during the Trump administration, that the United States would help to create an ever more integrated European continent, an ever closer union, went totally out the window. But also a long time before Trump, that idea of support for ever closer union had waned. And the turning point, as I said, was in the 1970s. What Trump spoke out aloud during his one-term presidency, Nixon and Kissinger spoke out to each other in private Oval Office. All the many notions which I just quoted about Trump can already be found in what Nixon and Kissinger said during their private time in the Oval Office and elsewhere. They also talked about bilateralism. They talked about suspicion and mistrust of the Europeans, and particularly about seeing the Europeans as competitors and rivals rather than partners and allies. However, on the whole, Nixon and Kissinger talked, let's say, a little bit more civilized than Trump did in public. At times, however, quite crude sentiment occurred during their conversations. They were very dismissive about the Europeans as such. They called them weaklings who were totally disunited together, who were militarily just forgettable. And also when they talked about individual European leaders, they were pretty frank in the utterance of each other. They did not trust Edward Heath, the British Prime Minister, who wanted to get Britain into the European Economic Community at the time. And they believed that he was a traitor to the Anglo-American cause. Pompidou, they realized, wanted to be the leader, the French president. He wanted to be the leader of Europe, and they tried to exploit that vanity, that egomania of Pompidou, which they seemed to have discovered. And in particular, they distrusted the Germans. This is surprising because Kissinger, of course, is German by birth, and his native language is birth, but he had a particular thing about the Germans. Perhaps this can be a background that's difficult to know. Both Nixon and Kissinger distrusted Ostpolitik, that Eastern policy towards rapprochement with the East a lot. They distrusted the Germans' very strong pro-integration attitude. They distrusted or were of a strong and healthy West German economy. And in particular, they also viewed individual German leaders as really beyond the pale. Schmidt, arrogant, which actually was quite true. And they particularly distrusted Willy Brandt, who they believed was a wishy-washy politician who could not be upon at all. There was one kind of unfortunate episode when they discussed that Brandt had just recovered cancer. They expressed their regret that Brandt had actually managed to overcome that severe illness so that they would have to deal with him for the next few years. They soon realized, however, what they were actually saying to each other and kind of apologized to each other and said, oh, well, we shouldn't really be saying that. When I first spoke to Henry Kissinger, that turning point in the 1970s, he became quite defensive and did not want to know. Instead, he kept talking about how good relations with were during the Gerald Ford administration, when Kissinger, of course, was still Secretary of State. And he was quite right. During the Ford administration, relations were quite good, but that had more to do with the personal relations of Gerald Ford to various individual leaders like Schmidt, like Giscard d'Estaing in France, like in Britain, and it had very little to do with structural elements. That was really totally based on a personal factor. And here, Gerald Ford, of course, was much than who always found it difficult to deal with people on an individual basis. Therefore, Kissinger didn't really want to recognize point in the early 1970s. But when we look closely at transatlantic relations during that time, when Nixon and Kissinger ruled the White House, so to speak, we can see a clear deterioration of transatlantic relations and the attitude towards the European continent than we have saw before. And ever since, I think the relations have gone downhill. By turning point, I don't mean 1 year or 1 month or 1 week, of course. I mean the entire period of Nixon's period in office, and particularly the years 1972 to 1974 were really the crucial period. As you all would like to rush out to buy the book, I know, I don't want to stop you, but perhaps I should enlighten you about the structure of the book. I briefly talk about the golden age of US relations with Europe in the 1950s. And here, of course, the United States was fully in support of creating a united Europe. The Marshall Plan comes to mind, but above all, the Schuman Plan, the European Coal and Steel Community, also the European Defense Community, treaties of 1957, which led to the European Economic Community. They all found the strong support of can argue without American support, something like the Schuman Plan and the EDC, perhaps even the Rome treaties, would never have happened. The Europeans would not have strong enough, united enough to actually try to realize these very visionary policies. American support was necessary, and it came forward to help Europeans to unite the continent. The reason why, of course, was to keep communism at bay, to create future American markets in the run, and to keep the West on the side of the United States. So there were kind of selfish reasons for America's support for united Europe, but it really worked on behalf of both the Europeans and the United States. Both sides benefited from it, and there's nothing wrong with such a policy. I then deal in the book, I then deal with the 1960s. Or maybe I should say before I go to the 1960s, that round about the late 1950s, already skepticism within the commerce departments in the United States arose regarding Europe. The commerce departments, the Treasury in particular, saw that the Europeans could become future economic rivals and competitors. But that was not the flavor of the month in the White House. Why didn't want to know about it? And Eisenhower and also Dulles, the Secretary of State at the time, really ignored these sentiments out of coming out. One example, there were US steel companies who protested about the discrimination of the European steel market against Americans. And Eisenhower and Dulles just ignored them, said, we know this is true, you are being discriminated against, but for the sake of Atlantic, for the sake of supporting Europe, we have to accept that discrimination. It has nothing to do with the free market and our normal ideology, but temporarily we just accept it. Then I deal with the 1960s, and that is a period of transition I make clear. Here, the Europeans increasingly independent, became increasingly confident because their economies were doing well, and that gave them new confidence. They also increasingly moaned about the burden of American leadership, America's unilateral behavior. They complained deeply about the Vietnam War and what they saw mistaken political military involvement in Vietnam, but also increasingly about American financial irresponsibility. And as the Vietnam War was fought without any tax increases, Johnson's social welfare program was done mostly without any any tax increases. The result was that the United States became increasingly indebted. That had consequences for the position of the dollar in the internet. The dollar kind of swamped European markets, and the Europeans complained about that, as it also drove their inflation higher. So they saw American financial behavior and, of course, also military behavior as irresponsible. And so the clash occurred between the late 1960s. Kennedy tried to offer concessions to the Europeans in the nuclear realm, for example, also by announcing trade rounds where trade relations were newly renegotiated and not without success. In the end, tension within the transatlantic alliance by the late 1960s really was escalating. And that brings me to Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. And Nixon, in a way, was unfortunate. When he came to office, he simply found this situation which I just described. That wasn't really his fault at all. And he was also that he became president when America's economic performance globally was less strong than in the years before. And he had the situation. But how he dealt with that situation, that of course was entirely up to Nixon and his administration. He did not have to do, or he did not have to pursue the policies he did pursue. But Nixon per se was not anti-European. In fact, he first was a supporter of Atlantic unity. When, for example, in 1946, as a young congressman, he went to Europe to visit the downtrodden states, destroyed states in Western Europe, he was shocked by what he saw: the destruction, the starvation, the attitude of the European people. And he came back home and became a strong supporter of the Marshall Plan. And then, why do you do that? The Germans, after all, have started the war, so they should really, not complain about having to face the consequences and the starvation. And Nixon replied, when civilized people encounter cannibals, they don't eat them, but they help them out of their dilemma. And so that was a fairly sensible attitude. And indeed, at the beginning of presidency, in February and March 1969, Nixon embarked on a big European trip. That was first president. He saw de Gaulle in Paris, and he also went to the UK. And in both Paris and London, he said European nationalism was still very much alive. Then he went to Rome, Bonn, and Brussels, and he realized that also there was very strong pro-European sentiments, sentiments for creating a united continent. And the lesson, to cut a long story short, the lesson took from that was that the Europeans would never really be able to get their act together. They were too divided, and he was very skeptical about that movement towards European integration. And Kissinger, at that stage, still someone who was much less important than years later, who had to fight for Nixon's attention still as national security advisor. But Kissinger reinforced him in that attitude. And he basically told him, the Europeans, if we strengthen them too much, they will become a third force in world affairs. That is not in our interest. So at best, let them get on with it. They want to create a united, integrated Europe. They should do that by themselves without American support. And both Nixon and Kissinger were convinced that the Europeans would never get there.
Klaus,
and Nixon kept complaining about the complaints we hear. Yeah.
Klaus, may I interrupt? Your audio is really unstable, the connection. I wonder if turning off your video might help a little bit for the remainder of your presentation, and maybe then turn it back on.
Okay, people will be shocked not to see me, but I try. Is that better?
So far.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. So Nixon started complaining and saying the similar things which President Trump complained about decades later, about the ungratefulness of the Europeans, their lack of military support for NATO, their strong competition in an economic and trade sense with the United States. And all that influenced Nixon's attitude toward the European integration process. However, what was most decisive was actually Nixon's election prospects. By 1971, once he had lost the midterm elections of 1971, he realized that without a strong economic effort, he may also lose the presidential election and thus his re-election in 1972. And he believed inflation is one thing. People always complain about inflation, but unemployment really matters. I have to bring American unemployment down, meaning I have to create a boom in the American economy. How do I do that? By, and that was his short answer really, by discriminating against European companies, European countries, so not to have them compete so viciously with American products. And that is what unfolded in the summer and fall of 1971. Eventually, when the situation became, in Nixon's eyes, so desperate that he seemed to be, that his reaction seemed to be totally endangered, he convened the Camp David meeting of August 15, 1971. That meeting was a meeting of his economic advisors. Kissinger was not invited, as he didn't seem to know too much about the economy. He was traveling, and also he didn't really want Kissinger's more international perspective. And at that Camp David meeting, it was decided that the Bretton Woods system would be finished. That meaning in practice, the system of fixed exchange rate would be given up, so that from now on exchange rates would float on the international market. Nixon expected would benefit the dollar, would benefit the price of American products worldwide. He also imposed wage and price controls, which was very popular with the American public. That, of course, was very Keynesian. That had nothing to do with the free market ideology which Nixon had supported until then, but he believed wage and price controls that it will make me popular for the forthcoming elections. He also tried to sell the gold dollars connection, and above all, and that annoyed the Europeans in particular, he imposed a 10% temporary tariff on foreign goods. And he announced that soon after in a big speech to the nation. And in Europe, 2 or 3 days, markets were closed. There was a severe shock, and these events are called the Nixon shocks. This was a severe shock to the system. Undersecretary Paul Volcker was sent to Europe to explain the situation to the Europeans, because they hadn't been informed. They didn't have a clue what would be hitting them. And in Europe, there was talk about a trade war to retaliate also with tariffs on American products and do other nasty economic things on America. In the end, that was not decided upon, as it was believed. A trade war among the most important countries in the world, economic-wise, made little sense. So in the end, negotiations were entered into, but these negotiations were only entered into because Kissinger pushed for them. Connolly, the Treasury Secretary, had actually tried to prevent that negotiations would take place at an early stage. It was Kissinger who saw the danger to the existence of the transatlantic alliance, and he pushed for negotiations. And in the end, that was what happened. And that led to the Smithsonian Agreement of December 1971. And that was supposed to resolve the economic dilemma. It was supposed to save the Bretton Woods system and make it a little more flexible and loose. And I don't want to go into the details here, but enough should be to say that over the next couple of years, monetary turmoil and financial disagreements between the transatlantic allies continued until by March 1970, the Bretton Woods system had died for good, and a system of flexible exchange rates was introduced. And that is the same system we are still having today. By that stage, in early 1973, Kissinger became totally worried about the state of the transatlantic alliance, and he gave his famous Year of Europe speech. And in that speech, he declared that a new Atlantic Declaration should be signed in order, on the model of the Atlantic Declaration of 1941 between Roosevelt and Churchill, to set the transatlantic alliance on a new footing. However, the speech was totally backfired, and even even Kissinger in his memoirs admits that the speech was not one of the best ideas he has ever had. So that modest degree of self-criticism means that even Kissinger, with hindsight, regarded the speech utter disaster. He talked about regional responsibilities for the Europeans and global responsibilities for the United States. And while that, in fact, was totally correct, the Europeans were still annoyed about it. But above all, that is what I argue in the book, is that the speech was less about regionalism and globalism. It was Kissinger's attempt to undermine the creation of an integrated European continent by imposing a new Atlantic Declaration on the transatlantic alliance, which of course was really very much a traditional American-led Atlantic Declaration, which would really have just confirmed the existing status quo relations between the United States and Europe. And that led to all sorts of difficulties with the Europeans. And Kissinger in particular complained in the summer of 1973 that the Europeans dared not to consult with the United States. He got totally worked up about that and believed that it was totally beyond the pale that the Europeans would first consult with each other before they talked to the United States. For him, that was not how the transatlantic alliance should be run. And similar things happened during that time. Also, European political cooperation, an initiative create a European foreign policy, irked him. Then in October 1972, at a summit in Paris, the Europeans declared that they wanted to create economic and monetary union within less than 10 years. That totally annoyed him. And sometime later, the Europeans gave out a declaration of European identity. All these for Kissinger were going into the wrong direction. It went into the direction of a united Europe, but a united Europe independent of the United States. And he always argued, if we have a united Europe, it should make relations with the United States easier rather than more complex and more complicated. And for him, that was totally unacceptable. And then there was the Yom Kippur War, the October War between Israel and a number of Arab states in October 1973. The Europeans were largely on the side of the Arab states, not least because of the oil weapon, and the Europeans were running out of oil, and all sympathy for Israel was forgotten when the selfish interest of oil was at heart. So most European countries sided with the Arab states who had the oil, to try to maybe a little similar to today with the Russia-Ukraine crisis. They tried to play both sides and tried to not to be in either way. And of course, that went down very badly in Washington. And in the end, Kissinger announced DEFCON 3, that was a worldwide nuclear alert in October 1973. And that was meant to prevent the Soviet Union from imposing its own forces into the Middle East to help the Arab states. That, with hindsight, and even at the time, was highly justified because there was no movement of Soviet forces into the Middle East. Kissinger liked to play power, but and liked to perhaps show how strong America was, how influential he himself was, because Nixon himself was indisposed. He had had a drink or two or three or four or five too much. And he was sleeping away in the private quarters of the White House, so he couldn't be asked whether he would actually agree with that nuclear alert. But for the Europeans, Europeans, they were not just shocked by that nuclear alert. For them, of course, it was close to a nuclear war, but they also realized that after all that financial and monetary irresponsibility of the last few years, there are now also seem to be security irresponsibility and military and nuclear irresponsibility on the part of the United States. So the United States had totally become an uncertain ally. And I think that was the lesson the Europeans drew from the whole Nixon years. While in the end, they had to sign the Atlantic Declaration, and the United States really reinforced its leadership position in the Atlantic Alliance. The Europeans simply were not strong enough, were not united enough to really put up much resistance in the end. However, the lesson they drew was that the United States was not as reliable an ally in all respects as they had been in the 1950s and even in the 1960s, that since the early 1970s, the United States had indeed become a very uncertain ally. And that thinking has been with relations until the very present. The climax, as I said at the beginning, was of course the Trump administration, but there were other serious of the Iraq invasion under Bush Jr., which led to severe transatlantic difficulties. While there have also been some exceptions like Gerald Ford or Bush Sr., where transatlantic relations were very positive, on the whole, since the Nixon administration, transatlantic relations have become much less close, much less divided, more tense. And sometimes you can say it's almost a miracle that we still talk about transatlantic relations. But right now, under the Biden administration, perhaps we will see a new spring for transatlantic relations. But I personally am very doubtful that that will be a lasting phenomenon. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Klaus. Thanks for accommodating my request there to go to audio only, but I think that helped a bit with catching the end of your presentation. Before I introduce our commentator, let me remind our audience that there are 3 ways for you to participate. You can use the raise hand function in the Zoom functionality and get in line for posing your question directly to Klaus and Carolyn. If you'd like, you can do so now. And that's in fact our preferred way of having the audience engage with our panelists. You can also post your question in the Q&A function up on top of the screen, in my case, and I will put your question to the panelists if there's time. If you are watching us on Facebook Live, feel free to email Rachel Wheatley at rwheatley@historians.org with your questions and comments, and Rachel will relay them to me. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce and welcome to the Washington History Seminar Professor Carolyn Eisenberg, Professor of US History and American Foreign Policy at Hofstra University. Having worked on Germany myself for a long time, Carolyn is certainly a big name in the field, and I've never been on a panel with her, so I'm particularly excited that she could join us this afternoon. She holds a PhD from Columbia University. Her book, Drawing the Line, The American Decision to Divide Germany, 1944 to 1949, published by Cambridge in 1996, was awarded the Stuart Burnouf Prize of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, the Herbert Hoover Library Prize, and the book was also a finalist for the Lionel Gelber Prize. Her book, Never Lose, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Myth of National Security, will be published by Oxford University Press, hopefully later this year. Again, wonderful to have you with us, Professor Eisenberg. The Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you. Okay. So it's an honor to participate in this event. And I especially want to express my thanks to Chris and others from the Woodrow Wilson Center and the National History Center for including me in this occasion. And let me begin by saying how much I learned from reading Uncertain Allies. The author takes up extremely difficult subject and traces the story in a clear and nuanced way. He's meticulous about evolving positions and manages to be detailed, but also highlighting the larger significance of these developments, which he describes. And of course, this narrative gains from importance in the context of the present conflict that's going on between the US, NATO, Russia, and the Ukraine. So I really found this book very helpful, and I hope others who are listening will read it. One disclaimer I say right away is that I read this book as someone who is not an economic historian and no authority on international monetary policy. I'm guessing that there are people in the audience with a greater, considerably more expertise in these matters who may want to offer comments and questions about that as we move along. As indicated in the introduction by Chris, my own forthcoming book on is focused on Nixon and Kissinger's policies pertaining to the war in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and their diplomacy with the Soviet Union and China. And as Klaus knows, I've taken forever to do this project, but now that we're very close to pre-publication, I'm checking footnotes. And I'm mentioning this otherwise uninteresting fact because my study is filled with thousands of documents of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger everywhere as I go through my footnotes. And I want you to picture that I'm reading this book by Klaus as I'm surrounded by all of these documents. And while I was reading this book, I was struck by the fact that despite this vast collection of paper that I have, there's almost no reference to the Nixon-Kissinger policies discussed in this book. Now, that's partly the problem of tunnel vision in the sense that in historical research, especially when, as in this case, the archival materials for Nixon and Kissinger are vast. So if your topic is Vietnam or relations with China, the natural inclination is to request the neatly organized boxes that say China, Vietnam, or whatever. But nevertheless, of my thousands of documents, many of them are broad in scope. And with that in mind, it raised the question for me of whether the absence of the topics in Klaus's book, even in meetings where a range of issues are being discussed, does not really express the fact that during their first administration, neither Nixon nor Kissinger were very interested in economic and monetary policy, especially as that concerned Europe. That it really was not a concern of theirs. And that the predominance of John Connolly in this field, especially in the autumn of 1971, is really a result of their indifference, by and large, to those policy questions. And I don't know that that's a disagreement with Klaus. I think your book can be read in that way, that this is actually something that they didn't care very much about. But it would be interesting to hear your reflections on kind of the hierarchy of what these two people were really concerned with. And then how do these policies connect to Nixon and Kissinger's thinking about future relations with the Soviet Union and the future of Eastern Europe? If in discussing European unity, Klaus does not always distinguish between the possible unity of continental Europe or simply the unity of Western Europe. Most of the time, I think you mean the latter, but that's not always clear. And I actually think it's significant that some significant amount of time, so Eastern Europe doesn't exist. So we're talking about a continent, but actually the continent doesn't really include Poland or Hungary or Czechoslovakia or whatever. But I think because sometimes that really starts to blur up in the narrative. Regarding Eastern Europe, Kissinger's attitude was very cynical from the outset. His hope was to lure the Russians into helping with Vietnam, but also in making a kind of grand bargain that he was imagining, which would stabilize the international scene. And one feature of this was to assure the Russians that the United States accepted the post-war division of Europe and would make no effort to alter this, with the exception, I mean, obviously Brandt forces a certain amount of change. And even from the beginning, Kissinger recognizes that there's some things about access to Berlin that probably should be figured out. But his attitude of, we don't care about Eastern Europe. He's telling that to Dobrynin within the first 2 months that he's in office and repeats it endlessly. And he even tells Dobrynin that sometimes the administration will say something bad about Eastern Europe, but don't even pay any attention. That's because of East Europeans that live in Michigan and vote. So my question to Klaus is really, how does this attitude about Eastern Europe affect the handling of Nixon and Kissinger when they're making decisions about Western Europe, and especially with regard to economic policy? Because you don't say very much about that, but I wonder, how that figures in the story. In the time remaining, I want to go back to this problem of tunnel vision or relevant context. And I'm saying that humbly because all I could think of as I was reading Klaus's book is, why don't I say more about economics than I do? Throughout the narrative, Klaus reminds the readers of certain external events to be considered: the Vietnam War, the foray into Cambodia, the summit conferences, Nixon's re-election, Watergate. But most often when these externals are mentioned, it's by way of pointing out how distracted Nixon and Kissinger might be at certain moments. But my bigger question is, how do these larger events affect economic policy in any other way other than distracting them? And I want to just take a couple of minutes to talk about some of the external developments that I think are potentially relevant, apart from the distraction, that might have played into the way Nixon and Kissinger were thinking about Western Europe. So one thing I want to mention, which I think is not in the book, is something called Lamps on 719. It's actually something that unfortunately a lot of historians have paid too little attention to. And that's the South Vietnamese foray into Laos in the winter and spring of 1971. And this is really the first test of whether the beefed up South Vietnamese army can function without the presence of US ground troops. By this point, tens of thousands of American troops have come home, many thousands are on their way home. And the idea was that, assisted by US air power, the South Vietnamese would go into Laos, remain there for 2 months or more, prevent enemy advances through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and kill a lot of them, kill a lot of enemy troops. Point about this is it's a complete flop, absolute disaster, punctuated. Some folks who are of the elderly sort, like myself, may remember those photos of fleeing South Vietnamese soldiers holding onto the skids of US helicopters. From the White House perspective, this is an unmitigated disaster for two reasons: because it illustrates the continued ineptitude of ARVN and the failure of their Vietnamization policy. But more relevantly, I think, and this gets us back to August of 71, the failure of Lamps on 719 virtually ensures that in 1972, there's going to be a dangerous enemy offensive. As election year, the whole point of Lamps on 719 was to make sure that that wouldn't happen. So that's what they're thinking about. And in Klaus, of course, for obviously sensible reasons, when he's talking about the decisions in the summer of 1971, talks about the economic factors that led to those decisions: high unemployment, inflation, unfavorable balance of trade. But leading Nixon to reject longstanding conservative ideas. But when I was reading Uncertain Allies, one question in my mind is, what role does a failing Vietnam policy and the associated political dangers of that failure play in economic decision-making, other than the fact that people are distracted and grumpy? Another contextual point is that because of Lamps on 719, Nixon and Kissinger have become far more dependent on the Soviet Union and the opening with China to help them obtain a favorable diplomatic settlement with Hanoi. Now, that interest was present from the outset of their administration. They want to open relations with China from the very beginning. They want Russian help with Vietnam from the very beginning. But now that a presidential election is looming, both of these things become a necessity. I want to just focus for a minute on the Russians. The idea that the Soviet Union might help didn't start with Lamson 719. This was an idea that Kissinger was probing in his earliest interactions with Dobrynin. And again, he kept throwing in, we won't bother you in Eastern Europe, but surely you can help us with this other little problem. But as relevant to today's discussion, one aspect of the approach was their belief that the Russians would be cooperative because of this writing off of Eastern Europe. And that goes back to the same question I started, which is, how does the administration's willingness to write off Eastern Europe influence their treatment of Western Europe across a whole spectrum of things, but particularly with respect to the topic of your book of economic policy? Does it have any impact on their economic decisions? And Klaus talks about a golden era in which US policymakers brought an internationalist perspective to their choices as opposed to the nationalist policy evident in the summer of 1971. But how does their changing relationship with the Soviet Union affect all of this? I want to say another word about relations with China. The invitation from the Chinese for a US emissary to visit their country and the subsequent invitation to Nixon for his visit is like a gift from heaven. They can't believe this good luck. I mean, they've been wanting this invitation all along, but they didn't get it. Given the shambles of Lamson 719, they think it's going to take Vietnam off the front pages. That'll be good. And there are lots of other benefits, more pressure on the Russians to give them a summit, meaning 2 dramatic Nixon summits in a difficult election year. And of course, if relations really improve, then Chinese will also help them press Hanoi into a favorable settlement. So as relations with China unfolded over the next 2 years, as well as improved relations with the Russians, did Kissinger and Nixon feel the same need for a strong West European alliance? And did that in turn reduce their willingness to accommodate the economic interests of their ostensible partners? For 3 minutes, I want to fast forward to February 1973. One of the problems about being on Zoom, you don't have like a timekeeper, holding up a little warning, whatever. But I want to just fast forward for a minute to February 73. By this time, Kissinger's made several trips to China, holding many long talks with Zhou Enlai. And the Paris Agreement has been signed, ending the US military presence in South Vietnam. And on this Beijing trip, Kissinger has many objectives, not the least of which is Nixon's desire to return to China, which is an emotional high point for him in his first term. And this new relationship is sufficiently important that Kissinger is granted a second personal meeting with Mao. And much of that conversation concerns Kissinger's promise to Mao that if China is attacked by the Soviet Union, the US will intervene on its behalf, which actually I think Mao is laughing when he said, reminds Kissinger that the American public hadn't been that crazy about the war in Vietnam and with whatever, might not love going to war for protect China. Anyway, emphasizing US reliability, Kissinger explains to Mao that because of US domestic situation, the Nixon administration sometimes used, quote, complicated methods. But with regard to our fundamental objectives, we will always act decisively and without regard to public opinion. If any hegemonial intentions became active, the United States would be firm in response. So Mao, hearing this, says, well, maybe the Americans and the Europeans would be happy to see the Soviets and the Chinese fighting one another, Mao wonders. And Kissinger replies, what Europe thinks, I am not able to judge, replied Kissinger. They cannot do anything anyway. They are basically irrelevant. This is not simply rhetoric. On his return to Washington, the National Security Advisor gave Nixon an exuberant report of this experience. And during his Chinese visit, he found himself, quote, in the extraordinary situation that with the exception of the United Kingdom, the PRC might well be the closest to us in global perceptions. Most remarkable were these leaders, Mao and Zhou Enlai. Quote, no other world leaders have the sweep and imagination of these two men, nor the capacity and will to pursue long-range policy. Of course, this is just a little snippet that I'm reading, but it gives rise to a practical and psychological question. Again, I keep coming back to this. Given these developing relationships with the Chinese and the Soviet Union, does Western Europe matter less as an ally? And on economic issues, then, if they matter less, can't more narrow US self-interest prevail? And is there also an emotional aspect to all of this? You know, as different as they are, both Nixon and Kissinger have in common their insecurity, grandiosity, and out of control need to be important. I think Klaus has a very good handle on Kissinger's psychology. And when you read the declassified materials, you get the impression that playing with the, quote, big guys, even if they happen to be communists, is more galvanizing than routinized dealing with old friends. Of course, we're deliberating today against the background of heightening tensions with Russia and of collaboration with our mainly West European allies. So I'm quite interested to hear Klaus' view on this crisis. Yet one thread I'm hoping you can develop, because it's not so clear in the book, which is how you see NATO in relation to US economic policy in the Nixon era and subsequently, because that's NATO's, you know, flits in and out a little bit, but how is that, you know, how do these stories connect, you know, which they surely must. In closing, so I've just given lots of questions, but in closing, I really want to emphasize how much I learned from this book and what an important and relevant piece of scholarship this really is.
Thanks so much, Professor Eisenberg. Klaus, there are a number of questions directed at you. Since we made reference to Secretary Connolly, and we have a broad audience, not just one of European or US specialists, just maybe give a quick idea as well to one of the characters that was mentioned. Klaus.
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Caroline, for reading the book in such coming up with so many interesting additional thoughts, which is much appreciated. I mean, there's a reason why I wrote this book, and one reason is when you think of Nixon and Kissinger, we automatically think of Vietnam. We think of Watergate. We think of Latin America. We certainly think of detente with China. We do not necessarily think of Western Europe. And I thought there is a gap in the literature, there's a gap in our knowledge, and that is the reason why I focus. Of course, when you go into Nixon's mind, and actually at the beginning of his term, he composes a list, says what is important, what is less important. Western Europe is way down. It is certainly much lower down than Vietnam. Vietnam was much more important for Nixon and dealing with the Soviet Union well. And then later, of course, Watergate became all important, became even more important than Vietnam or anything else, because it was his survival. In that, it's correct. But when we look at, for example, what is going on now with Russia, Ukraine, of course, Biden and Putin, that is a big play in town. However, Europeans cannot be ignored, and Biden does his best to bring them in. And I think that was what Nixon and Kissinger also realized after a little White House. Initially, for example, on that list which Nixon composed, he said, monetary affairs, don't bother me with it. Don't talk to about monetary affairs. Within a year, he just talked about monetary affairs like daily with Kissinger. I'm not saying it's more important than Vietnam or Watergate, not at all, but it did not become unimportant. It actually became increasingly important. And the more he realized that his re-election might be dependent on competition and rivalry with the Europeans in an economic sense, the more he became interested in monetary affairs, the more he became interested in what the Europeans were actually doing on the European continent, that they were becoming more independent, hedging plans among themselves, which run counter to America's interest, meaning his own interest in winning re-election. And I think that is where I would like to say dealings with transatlantic allies, particularly with the European allies within the European community, became highly important for the survival of Richard Nixon in office. And he had that love affair of the mind, as someone called it, with John Connolly, his Treasury Secretary. Of course, because he was a man who was severely wounded when he was in Dallas with John F. Kennedy, and the assassination on John F. Kennedy place. Kennedy died. Connolly, after many weeks in hospital, survived. And he was at heart, though officially he was a Democrat, at heart he was Republican. And he eventually also joined the Republican Party. And Nixon always saw him as his heir, as the future president he wanted to grow. And Kissinger became extremely jealous of Connolly because Nixon and Connolly seemed to hit it off much better at times than Kissinger and Nixon did. And so that rivalry between Kissinger and Connolly for the favor of Nixon, if you like, for the love of Nixon, that came into that entire picture. And when what I said about the August 1971 meeting, which then led to negotiations with the European, didn't want to end. He wanted to drag them on, drag them out, because it seemed to be in his interest. After a while, Kissinger lost patience with that attitude, not just because of the poor Europeans, but also because of himself and his own standing. So Kissinger went behind Connolly's back and started working on Nixon and saying, my dear president, the transatlantic alliance is being undermined here. The longer you wait with these serious negotiations, we are in trouble. And he, of course, at the same time, used the opportunity to undermine Connolly. And in the end, he succeeded in doing that. And the Smithsonian Agreement was concluded because Kissinger pushed seriously for negotiations. And Nixon and Kissinger and French President Pompidou met at the Azores, and the Smithsonian Agreement essentially was already decided in that bilateral meeting. And Connolly wasn't even there. He was totally excluded. And that was of Kissinger's concern, but also because of Kissinger's ego and feelings of competition for the favor of Nixon. So I think that all that becomes highly important and cannot be ignored and should not be ignored by just focusing on great power politics, China, the Soviet Union, or Vietnam, and other things. Nixon realized, and Kissinger even more so, if you want to have foreign policy with China and the Soviet Union, you have to present a united Western camp. You cannot present to the Chinese and the Soviet total polarization within the Western camp. That makes you weak. That will not give you more strength to negotiate with them. And that is he told Nixon around about that time in late 1971, if there are summits coming up with Moscow and Beijing, you need to find concessions with the European in the monetary realm in order to have that united Western camp. So that did influence policy in that kind of way to get the act together. What else did you say? Regarding Eastern Europe and Western Europe, yes, my book is about European integration, that is Western Europe. Whether or not Eastern Europe was becoming looser connected with the Soviet Union or not, that played no role for the European integration context. It was clear, even if Poland became less connected to the Soviet Union and became, maybe like Yugoslavia in the best of cases, like in between the camps, would never become part of an integrated Western European continent. That was not the vision of Kissinger and Nixon. So what they focused on regarding European integration was what continental Europeans, plus the British, who then joined the EEC, were up to. And they feared that the Western Europeans, economically easily strong, that is also what the United States feared, were not a helpful third force in world politics, that they were becoming an independent, a competing force in world politics. And Kissinger in particular was very suspicious about that. And he more than once said, particularly the Germans, should not let go by themselves. You should keep them well integrated into the Western camps. All the other European states as well, but certainly the Germans. Don't let them, break out. And Kissinger in 1973 in particular, before and after his Year of Europe speech, he suggested to Nixon, we should not just not support European integration, we should actively undermine it, drive a wedge between them. And he asked, when the Europeans talked about a joint monetary float of the European currencies, he was convinced it was a beginning of an independent European currency. And he talked to the Treasury Secretary. In the end, it was George Shultz, but also Shultz's predecessor, and said, is that true? Is that not endanger our own economic position in the world markets? And Shultz was much more easygoing about it. And he was an economist. He said, no, won't really bother us that much. First of all, they won't get their act together. Secondly, even if they do, they will not immediately become strong, have a strong currency which could compete with the dollar. Kissinger listened to that, then he went back to the Oval Office and told the exact opposite to Nixon, because he was so worried about that development of independence in all respect. So monetary affairs, of course, could not compete with Vietnam for Nixon's attention, but it certainly had a lot of his attention. When you listen to the conversations with Kissinger and Shultz and other people which Nixon conducted, there was a lot about Western Europe, about economic competition, and so on. And also, think back about to Trump. Trump, of course, talked about Saudi Arabia, talked about China and North Korea, but he was also obsessed with economic competition from Europe. And that was in a way the same for Nixon. There were clear similarities in their thinking, not necessarily how they then expressed it to the wider public. They were worlds apart, but in their thinking, there were certainly clear similarities. Then maybe lastly, the NATO alliance. This is still what we see today. NATO is good, European unity, so at best. All the American governments have been in support of NATO. The one clear reason is because they dominate NATO. In security policy, we still know the Europeans spend much too little, and they are no competitor at all. To be a competitor, but they certainly have no military to speak of. And that really includes the British and the French. They wouldn't like to hear that, but they are not strong military compared to other countries in the world or compared to their past imperial militaries. So NATO is clearly dominated by states. That is a good alliance. That is the alliance we want. European unity dominated by economic affairs, by political strivings, by monetary policies, and all these kind of more progressive ideas about what a country should look like. That is something which has touched with a lot of skepticism, and that applied to Nixon and Kissinger. But I think it still applies to our world today, certainly to Trump, but also to NATO is the positive alliance. The rest has to be seen at least skeptically. Maybe I should stop here.
Yeah, why don't we bring in some?
I should refer to.
Yeah. Let's bring in some voices from some questions from the audience. Klaus, your audio is still not great. I would suggest you turn off the video for the remainder, maybe until the very end, just so we can appreciate more what you have to say. I'd like to call on.
I'm sure people have seen.
Johannes Ahlefeld. Johannes Ahlefeld, please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself. There you go.
Whether it works. Things have moved on. I've been studying at Duke University for Klaus, by the way, in the early 90s. And one of the things in my study of foreign aid policy of the Nixon-Kissinger administration was actually coming across the disruption by Brandt of the gold standard. Actually, during the course of Vietnam War, a major challenge to US hegemony. And I think that is still one of the puzzling things today. And the connection to the present situation actually is, in the Western camp, how can we really strengthen the alliance without a more equitable relationship between the US and the EU? And is this on the plate of the Biden administration? Klaus sounded a little bit skeptical in his last comments, in reply to Carolyn's comments. Or does the US actually just seek a loyal ally supporting the US course of action in the context of rivalry with China for global hegemony, and at the same time kind of countering Russia more effectively in Europe, allowing the US to concentrate on the Asian theater of operations? I think that this looks a little bit too tactical or whatever, too operational. I think in terms of engaging our relationship, can we think bigger and more political?
Well, that would be very nice, but I am quite skeptical. I mean, why did Biden not go to Putin and take Macron and the new German Chancellor Scholz along? You know, why not? What would have been wrong with that? Of course, it didn't even appear to him. It has to be a meeting at the top two level. You know, to include any European leaders was, I'm sure, wasn't seriously considered in the White House at all. The United States wants to continue being in charge of the alliance. This is pretty obvious. Of course, they grant more rights of say and participation to the European allies than they did many decades ago, but the United States does not wish to give up leadership. And in a way, from an American point of view, this is totally understandable. It also brings less coherence, less harmony into it if you have too many cooks, you know, involved in the cooking. You know, from an American point of view, it's perfectly understandable. For Nixon and Kissinger in the 1970s, coming out of a period not that long after the Second World War, where they, in the 1950s, totally dominated the transatlantic alliance. For them, it was even more difficult to understand that there should be something like equality or European participation in the major decision-making fields. And the prime example is, of course, nuclear weapons. Up to this day, no American president will share the decision to drop a nuclear bomb on Europe with anyone in Europe. Of course not. And that certainly was the case many decades ago. So in that respect, as far as the real structure is concerned, not that much has changed. What I would like to add about that current war in the 1970s, the Europeans saw a non-flexible fixed exchange rate as stability. They believe that gives the world stability and reliability. And the United States, under the Friedman's ideology, neoliberalism, increasingly believed that fixed exchange rates would constrain economic growth, would be bad for America. And that was the reason why they wanted to go for flexible exchange rates. And Nixon believed flexible exchange rates would benefit the dollar. It would create a boom, or at least a much better economy in the United States. It would thus help his re-election prospect. And for the Europeans, they believed it was too dangerous, too risky. It was really not stable enough.
Thank you. Professor Eisenberg, feel free to chime in at any point. Let me call on Mark Thomas Patterson now. Please unmute yourself.
Hello. This was first thing an amazing panel. And I have a question directed at Larres. Professor Larres, in your presentation, Professor Larres, and in your discussion of your book, you argue that Nixon and Kissinger's stance towards Europe has continued on throughout American policy and has impacted both policies you referenced, impacting both the Trump administration and also the Biden administration, this complicated attitude towards European unity. And I was wondering if you could say anything on the impact this had on the American I don't know if this came up in your research, about the impact this had on the anti-détente right. Because a major part, and this being figures such as Reagan, of the right stance was the fact that the US wasn't being active enough against communism and was not paying enough attention to Europe. And with this, there was a sense that America was getting too withdrawn and was not being active enough. But at the same time, they were very skeptical of Ostpolitik and Europe's, by and large, embrace of détente. So I'm curious if you could say anything to what extent did Nixon's and Kissinger's stance towards Europe influence the American right and, say, the presidency of Ronald Reagan and beyond?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Nixon and Kissinger were not keen on West Germany's Ostpolitik either. They of course were proponents of American superpower détente, but they believed that what the French and the Germans did with their own little European détente, that should not happen. That should really be all in America's responsibility. If anyone did détente, it should be the United States. Of course, grudgingly, they had to accept that there was European détente, but that was a struggle, and that contributed to the mistrust Nixon had towards the Europeans, that they went off on their own regarding détente with Europe. Therefore, I think the American right distrusted Nixon and Kissinger's let's say, too liberal, too flexible, too non-hardline position towards the Soviet Union. And that, I don't think that was influenced by the fact that Nixon himself was very dubious about, say, West German Ostpolitik. For the American right, Kissinger for many years was really a person not to be talked to, not to be taken seriously because of his détente policy, which seemed, in the last ascent, seemed to accept communism as a fact of life for a long time, and that they could not accept. Communism needed to be fought, needed to be defeated, needed to be brought down. You could not have a political or a policy of political coexistence with the devil, and that was as communism was seen. And I think Nixon and Kissinger's European policy only confirmed them in that respect. I don't think they gave much thought to Nixon and Kissinger's policy towards politics as such.
Thank you. May I call on Leon Fink now? Leon Fink, please unmute yourself.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, yes. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Professor Larres. You give a very clear sense of the voices of Nixon, Kissinger, and Connally, and the logic of the administration through these years. Since especially there was a Democratic Congress throughout this period, and since the Democrats were raising hell against Nixon about Vietnam, at least, I'm curious whether the Nixon-Kissinger forces had to contend with opposition from the Democrats in their relations with Europe. You mentioned their concern about the coming 1972 election, but I hadn't heard yet any voices about domestic political pluralism or opposition. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Nixon played the game quite skillfully together with Connally. By the imposition of wage and price controls, how could Democrats possibly be against that? That seemed to favor the American consumer, and Nixon, portrayed himself as the guy who was in favor of the little man who did something for the ordinary man and woman in the street. And obviously that could not be opposed by the Democrats. There was criticism about bad relations with Europe, that the transatlantic alliance should be better than it was, less tension and so on. But that, was not all that effective. there was the demand by Congress to withdraw troops from Europe for largely economic and financial reasons. And also the argument was always made because the Europeans are not really true allies anyway, so why should we benefit them with leaving our soldiers to that? And there were several attempts made during the Nixon administration to withdraw troops from Europe and relocate them to the United States or partially to other areas in the world. And they eventually got nowhere. And one has to give credit to Nixon and Kissinger that they were totally alarmed by that. They did not use that opportunity to say, yes, let's do so. Let's show the Europeans that we can squeeze them. They were alarmed by the effect on the Cold War that would have, on how the Soviet Union would see that if the United States withdrew troops from Europe. That would be seen by, they interpreted, by the Soviet Union as a weakening of American resolve, a weakening of American power. So, and despite all their criticism of Europe, the Nixon administration themselves sometimes threatened the Europeans if they didn't behave. Nixon often said, if you don't play fair game in the economic realm, we may well think about leaving our troops on the European continent. We may withdraw them. But when it came to it, the Mansfield Amendment came to a vote, Nixon became totally frantic and tried and did his best to convince Congress in the end to accept the amendment. Donald Rumsfeld, who was NATO ambassador at that time, he was called back to Congress to testify how disastrous the role of American troops from Europe would be regarding relations with the Soviet Union. So here you have to give credit to Nixon, despite all difficulties with the Europeans. When it came to it, the Cold War was more important than showing the Europeans who the boss was.
Thank you. I'll call on Daniel Teodoro. Mr. Teodoro, if you could please unmute yourself. Can we bring Mr. Teodoro up on the screen? Apparently your mute cannot be undone, so I'm being told you're using an old version of Zoom, Mr. Teodoro. Let me see if I can get you in the Q&A, but let me call on Michael Novak, please. Please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Now can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, sorry, it was saying I was muted and not muted, but anyway, thank you for being here today. My question is, in all of these, because when we talk about the transatlantic alliance between the United States and Europe, we forget that Canada is part of that too. From your research, did Canada play any role in these sort of debates at all, or they kind of just shunted off to the side and not really doing anything?
No, as far as I could see, no. I mean, in the Atlantic, the new Atlantic Declaration of 1974, Canada was an active player and they participated in drawing up the declaration. But the United States was not scared by Canadian economic competition. All the Canadians did not want to draw up their own currency system. They were easy about Bretton Woods. They were not the driving force behind that and a joint European float and things like that. So in that respect, Canada did not induce any fears or any panic or any antagonism among the Nixon administration. Certainly not to be compared with what the Europeans did or how they were seen by the Nixon administration.
Thank you. There's a question from William Walker in the Q&A. Who would like to argue that Nixon understood enough about monetary policy to resort to monetary brinkmanship, in part through his new economic policy. His goal was to maintain US primacy at the expense of Western Europe. The Smithsonian agreements suggest his economic nationalism failed. would Professors Larres and Eisenberg please comment? Klaus and perhaps Rusty, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I to be honest, I don't think that Nixon did understand monetary policy all that well. He initially had advisors who he got during his first year, who he got rather fed up with because they recommend gradualism. Gradualism meaning that he had to gradually improve the American economy and do things gradually, as the names. And by 1971, particularly after the midterm elections, he realized that gradualism had led to a defeat, and gradualism had made the American or brought it into dire straits, so that he had to fear for re-election. Unemployment was rising, inflation was rising, inflation of 10% he was seeing, and 6-7% unemployment rate, and he believed that is unacceptable for winning another term in office. So he totally removed his gradualist economic advisors and brought in new advisors, and one of them was Treasury Secretary Connolly. Connolly was not really an expert either. Connolly once said that I'm not really an economist. I know enough about economists to understand the papers I'm being given, but that was about it. So, you know, they were not really economic expert at all. They relied on people like Volcker or the director of the Federal Reserve Board, people like that who had an economic sense. But what Nixon was all about was winning next election. You win an election with the help of a flourishing economy. So his goal was bring down unemployment, bring about a boom so that the American consumer feels well. They have money in their pocket, they like to spend. If that is happening a month or two before the election comes around, I stand a chance to be re-elected. And he gave that order to his economic advisors, and everything else was really not really of interest to him. But that was, of course, a nationalist foreign policy, nationalist for the American consumer, but really nationalist above all. And he really cared less about the economic consequences of his policy. We know now that Nixon's economic policy led to high inflation by the late 1970s. And Volcker, who then became Federal Reserve Chief, had to resort to very harsh measures to keep a policy of austerity to keep or to bring inflation rates down. That originated with the Nixon administration. But Nixon couldn't care less about the economic consequences. First of all, he probably didn't understand the consequences. And secondly, he wanted to win the election. Never mind what happened in 5 years. He wanted to win a year from now. And that is, of course, politics for you. You know, when you look at current politicians, or if for that matter, current CEOs, they're concerned about what is happening in the next quarter, the next 2 quarters. They're not interested in what is happening in the next 5 years, because by then they may be out of office anyway, as was Nixon's reasoning. In 5 years' time, I finish my second term, let my successor deal with the consequences.
Thank you. Carolyn, any?
I don't have a comment, and I'm just looking and seeing there's several more questions. I have one question towards the end that I'd like to ask Klaus, but maybe we could let 1 or 2 other people who are trying to speak come in.
Well, I wanted to give Daniel Theodora, who has who we couldn't bring on personally. He's got several questions in there, including one. Klaus, he asked, how do you explain Richard Nixon's admiration for de Gaulle personally, the high personal esteem he held de Gaulle in?
No, he was, yes, that's a good question. A question I would like to answer. It's relatively, because he was overawed by de Gaulle. I once asked Kissinger, said, so when you first met de Gaulle together with Nixon, were you overawed by him? Not. Of course, he was just, of course, he would not admit to that. But in fact, when you read the documents, when you read witness accounts or memoirs, you can clearly see both Kissinger and Nixon were overawed by that last leader of the Second World War, the guy who had negotiated with Stalin Churchill and Roosevelt, who knew all these guys. That was, one of the great politicians of the 20th century in their view. And on top of that, de Gaulle was a nationalist, and Nixon was a nationalist. He could connect with him. Of course, the other one was French nationalist, American nationalist, but still there was something connecting them. De Gaulle had visionary plans about France's position in the world of great powers. That was Nixon thinking as well. Really like to deal with monetary affairs and gold standards and all currency fluctuation rates. This bored Nixon. He had to, because that before he wanted to be re-elected. But really, is it that exciting to deal with fluctuation rates of the Bretton Woods system? Is it 2.5% or 2%? Of course, that excites anyone who's not an economist. And de Gaulle was just like that. He thought in visionary, great policy terms, like Nixon wanted to be seen and wanted to think. So in a way, it was not surprising that he was both overawed by de Gaulle and also much admired him.
Thank you.
And the same applied to Churchill, by the way. He also was a big admirer of Churchill.
Thank you. Rusty,
Lem, I'll come in. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah. Such are the perils of Zoom. And I'm not sure that I'm hearing Klaus very clearly on several points. So I sort of want to aggregate all my questions and come back to sort of a core question, which is that it sounds to me as though you think that this economic policy towards Western Europe was evolving for reasons that don't have very much to do with the larger, politics with Russia, politics with China, or any of it. That am I hearing you correctly that you don't actually think that those larger things, which may be very important in other ways, but they're not really having a significant effect on economic policy? I'm not sure I'm hearing you or reading you correctly, but I just want to give you an opportunity to speak to that.
Only insofar that there needed to be a united Western camp. And that required that also in economic and monetary policies, the Western allies were united following the leadership of the United States and were not deeply polarized, were not trying to become independent actors and perhaps in the end cutting independent deals with the Union. In that respect, it was important, but not the details. The details were Western European political details. The big picture was to keep the keep the Western camp united for all these policies. You know better than I do.
Thank you. We're just about out of time. Just a quick response to two questions, one by David Sobelson on, do you more generally see a systematic difference between Republicans and Democrats regarding a united Europe? And then related to that, are there any key American supporters were there any then of the EU? If you could just in a minute wrap that up. Thank you.
Yes, a little bit. But Eisenhower was a strong supporter of the United Europe, and he was a Republican. So exceptions justify the rules, so to speak. But Truman, the Democrat, was strongly behind the European process. Clinton and Obama were lukewarm, but not anti-European integration. They were not strong proponents, but they were certainly not opposed. While Trump and Bush Jr. were particularly opposed. On the other hand, Bush Sr., a Republican, was also very strongly in support of European integration. So I think it depends on the times rather than on the party and the personalities of the person involved.
Thank you. With apologies to all of those who we couldn't call on today, and with apologies for the technical difficulties. Klaus, if you want to put your video back on, thank you. As well as a big thank you to Professor Eisenberg. And with that, I'll turn it over to my co-chair, Eric Arneson. Eric.
And thank you, Christian, as well as Klaus and Carolyn. Please join us next Monday on February 14th at 4 p.m. when the Washington History Seminar returns for our fourth session of the new year, this one focusing on Tomiko Brown Nagin's just published Civil Rights Queen, Constance Baker Motley and the Struggle for Equality, with discussants Risa Goluboff and H. Timothy Lovelace. And with that, take care, be safe, and good night.